Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Halbert, and I have been studying Chicago's academic urban jungle. And by that, I mean the effect of greening Chicago's public schools by a program called Openlands. So today, what I'll be going over when I talk about my project is I'll be talking about the context, what has been going on up until now, the literature review that others have studied of this topic up until this point, the data description where I've retrieved all of my information, the results that I came to, and the conclusion that I derived from them. So for current context, why I focus on Chicago schools and its green space. Um, Surely many of you have heard in the news of all of the Chicago school teachers walkouts and strikes that have been happening in the last few years. There's actually one going on while I've been conducting this research. They just went back to school in November, but they didn't meet all their demands, so I'm sure there'll be another one coming up in the near future. And within 5 years, the typical CPS, that's Chicago Public School, will lose over half of its teachers. Within 5 years, they have a complete 50% turnover rate of their faculty. In CPS, 94 Chicago Public Schools earned low performance rating. That's almost mind-boggling. After 15 years of consecutive drops, the number of students enrolled in Chicago's public schools fell again this year being the school year of 2019, school 2020. Enrollment dropped another 2.7%, well over 300,000 students from the previous fall, according to a count taken on the 20th day of school. Of these low performance ratings that were given by the city of Chicago, there's been a map created in the top left. In the top left, that's the whole city of Chicago. Each one got a color code based off of the lowest performing schools by their neighborhood. And the amount of red there is staggering. So there's absolutely a need to study what can help these schools and especially what can help these teachers. I do want to note on this topic while we're talking about teacher strikes that uh, 2012 was the first time since 1987 that Chicago had a teacher strike, and they've had one multiple times a year, almost every year since 2012. So I think that there's something to be said about that, and that's why I would like to focus a little more on teachers than most studies have been in the past. And this is the environmental flip side of this. As EAB, it's the emerald ash borer in Chicago. It is now considered the most destructive pest, the most destructive forest pest ever seen in North America. It definitively kills ash trees upon infection. There is a 100% fatality rate of infected trees. So, um, every this is especially a problem in Chicago because of their lack of diversity in the urban forest. So while this is problematic, it's also an opportune time to restart. Um, there is, according to this chart that I've gotten my hands on in the city of Chicago, table 9 in the middle here, it says that 2 of the top 3 most populous trees by area in the city of Chicago are both ash trees. These are both the types of trees that the emerald ash borer will definitively kill. 2 of the top 3. And in the table next to it, CTI stands for Commercial Transport Institution, so this will include school grounds. It has over 700,000 ash trees in their land use category. So this absolutely affects schools as well. That's a lot of trees that are subject for removal. In the top left, the street tree population, green ash is at the very top. And in the city of Chicago, graph right underneath it, the very first bar, you'll see the green bar section of CTI of, again, that's school grounds. We have a lot of leeway here for planting more trees, and there's a lot of potential here for us. So, what I want to know after all of that being said is the city-owned area defined as CTI, Commercial Transport Institution, has a 9.7% plantable area that has not been planted yet. That's granting a potential for schools to allot for a lot more green space. And at this critical time for Chicago when the urban forestry is in transition and the city schools are making applications to direct their funding, this is a pivotal moment to consider linking the two issues at hand. A school greening initiative called Openlands has done just that in Chicago, providing green spaces on school grounds for students. This research aims to measure the effects of the greening on these schools since implementation. This focus this study focuses on what Openlands has accomplished um, in the last few years. Some schools they started planting as early as 2013 and some as late as 2015, 16, or 17, but mostly between 2013 and 2015. And coincidentally, that's around the same time, right after most of these teacher strikes have started back up again. That's after the time that the emerald ash borer has become such an invasive species. I think it was the first time it was found was 2007 in Chicago. Um, but it didn't become so destructive until the 2010s. So all of these events are coinciding around 2010, 2013, and since Openlands has begun their initiative, I want to see if there has been any changes by the schools touched by Openlands in the last 5 years. Ultimately, what I want this to find is, are the schools going to be justified to allocate funds toward the greening? And in light of teacher strikes, can an initiative like Openlands prove to help the school environment for the teachers and students alike? So these are the prior research linking greening and scholarly behaviors that I've found so far. This one will be the most similar to what I want to do. Um, the title will be in the little caption over here. So if anything in my literature review you would like to follow up with, the title will be in this caption, and you can find that in my sources at the end. This experimental study simply took window views into account when testing attention restoration and stress. They measured that by the Trier stress test, a visual stress test, body temperature, and an EKG, finding that green views had a much higher attention score after the break, uh, where they casually looked out a window, and they scored far better in psychological stress at the end of the class period. So what I found exceptionally interesting about this one is that they only measured green space by a window view. They did not use street views. They did not measure canopy. They did not use aerial views or light radar detection. They simply measured green space by the exact same way that students would measure green space or experience green space, is simply through a window or what they're able to see. And for that reason, I have only included greening in the study if it is within 200 feet of the school. So this is a work by Ming Kuo. He has dedicated a lot of his research to the benefits of nature, and this is one of the two works that I've cited by him. Here Kuo lists many of the benefits from nature which are easily considered beneficial to school performance. Some of that being decrease in violence, which would help teacher retention, which I'll get to in just a moment. Vitality, which would keep students from going home early because they felt a little sick. Attention restoration, better sleep, better social ties, which helps prevent truancy, juvenile delinquents, ADHD, anxiety, migraines, all of these things. So it should seem obvious that these benefits linked with nature would also help school performance. This is a second work by Ming Kyo. He did this work specifically on Chicago. Specifically on Chicago, the city of Chicago schools. that were the most disadvantaged and coincidentally the worst performing. He found that the most disadvantaged schools have the least amount of tree cover. That's shown in the top right-hand side. And he considered disadvantaged by the percentage of students that were given a free lunch. And you can see by the chart, the least disadvantaged had the most percent of tree cover, even though they're still clearly very disadvantaged. And the most disadvantaged, which had up to 100% students eligible for free lunch, had as little as 9% of school under tree cover. It should be noted that he did measure tree cover by aerial light detection radar measurement. This is further shown in the results that tree cover is significantly related to academic achievement, with school trees being the most relevant. His most relevant as in more relevant than neighborhood trees. Trees in front of a home are less predictive of academic achievement than trees within school grounds. His work specifically focused on Chicago schools. To quickly go over some more of my literature review, these are the three that inspired me to bring a place-based approach to Chicago school reform. Sampson in 1995 tells me when faced with trends recurring in the same areas over many years, despite population turnover of both teachers and students, it must be argued that the characteristics of the areas are more predictive than the individuals themselves. Susser in 1996 tells me recent studies on academics diverts focus from studying individuals and their lifestyles to environmental characteristics and their impact. Holder in 1998 says, should a program focus on high-risk individuals, it would only produce short-term results per the high turnover rates. So in a city like Chicago, where we can clearly see that there's a lot of teacher mobility, a lot of student mobility, people moving in and out, but mostly out, to that making educational reform in the version of a program that focuses specifically on the students would not produce as great results when those students are bound to leave within a year or two or switch schools within a year or two. It would be more appropriate to focus on programs that help the area that way the area will help everyone that comes through the area and not just the ones that are there in that school right then and there. So teacher mobility, I'm going to try to go through this a little faster. This slide indicates only a few of the many reasons that Chicago schools have comparatively low retention rate. Half of a school's teachers leave within 5 years. This study surveyed CPS teachers specifically over a 6-year period with these results. If of these three things, stability was higher in schools where students reported a safer climate and support from peers. So hypothetically, theoretically, if trees reduce crime rates, there should be more teacher stability in schools where trees are planted. Schools lose teachers when student enrollment declines. There is a 15-year trend in enrollment loss in Chicago. So if trees or investment back in school landscaping can convince students and parents to stop leaving the city, it will also convince teachers to stay as well. Stability was higher where teachers believed their colleagues were innovative and shared a sense of collective responsibility for school improvement. I certainly think that investing in the school aesthetics, landscape, um, gardening, all of these things would be considered school improvement. So it should absolutely help with teacher retention. This one was the most powerful, I think, and it absolutely speaks to the causes of the teacher strikes. They find that having 10 more trees in a city block on average improves health perception in ways comparable to an increase in annual personal income of $10,000 and being moved to a neighborhood with $10,000 median income or feeling younger. I definitely recommend someone following up, any of you following up with the research titled Neighborhood Green Space and Health in a Large Urban Center. I found it incredibly interesting. With all of that being said, sources tell us that green space is beneficial to our actual health, perceived health, and attention. It must be noted that these sources more often than not use aerial views and sophisticated technology to count green space. However, this study will count all schools that have been implemented in the program in the same way. They will all be considered greened. The data was not clean enough to get a specific measurement of exactly how much was planted at each school, so they'll simply be compared green schools to non-green schools. My hope is the research will tell me, can these factors be compounded as they relate to teacher retention and student attendance to reflect in their performance? To what extent can it justify greening of the schools? So these are all my data sources and variable definitions. My Google Earth Pro data and my Excel sheet data were both from Openlands directly. They gave me this data. I'm going to show it right quick. This is a map of the city of Chicago, and each yellow dot represents a tree that Openlands has planted in the city. And each green square represents a school that received a garden. And the blue dots that you can just barely see represent school grounds. These are not all necessarily school grounds that received planting, but I believe that they showed this specifically so that we could see the spatial relationship to schools that did receive planting to other schools in the area, for example. So the school grounds are these yellow squares with blue outlines. These are the trees, and these are the neighborhood boundaries that they outlined for me. I specifically highlighted these in green for research purposes. I'll be getting to that in a moment, but you can see that in this area there's a higher cluster than anywhere else in the city. They probably got the most trees in the smallest area compared to everyone else. So I wanted to highlight that for this next reason. Then the Excel sheet. They gave me this Excel sheet here. As you can see, the data is not super clean or great, but they did show me every single recipient of a tree since 2013, every single tree that was given. Not all of these are schools, so I had to separate them, which ones were schools and which ones were residential or commercial. And I put both of these into Google My Maps so I could get a spatial view that included their performance rating that was given by the city and the state. And that's here. It's Google My Maps. I have here we go. So these are all of the recipients within the city of Chicago. As you can see, there are a lot more green schools. These are color-coded. Blue is the best performing. Dark red is the worst performing. Yellow is average. You can see there are a lot more green than there is red. And these red boundaries are the lowest performing schools by community that we saw earlier. So I wanted to know if there was any bias in any of the schools that received trees. I wanted to know how many of the lowest performing schools actually got trees planted. And as you can see, of the lowest performing schools, only 1, 2, 3. only 3 low-performing schools in all of the lowest-performing school neighborhoods actually got trees planted. So I find that an interesting bias that I wanted to explore later. So I highlighted this area in green. That's the area that was outlined in green on the other map. I did that because I wanted to focus on a certain cluster of neighborhoods to compare the green schools to the non-green schools. And I chose this area because it has the highest concentration of lowest performing schools. And as we saw on the other map, they also had the highest concentration of trees planted. The next closest one would be this cluster right here. But I did not choose them because this cluster already lives around some parks, whereas this does not. This is already really barren. So I wanted to prevent any bias that would suggest that comparing a greened school to a barren school would be equivalent to comparing a green school to a non-green school. When, or a school with greenery compared to a school without greenery. But what I wanted to actually compare in the study was the actual process of greening a school. Is there a difference in the process of greening a school than a school that was already greened or just not green? It's the process of greening that I wanted to compare. So again, these are the boundaries, and here are all of these schools in that same neighborhood that did not receive trees. So these are all of the schools together, the non-recipients, and as you can see, there are a lot of low-performing schools here as well. All right. Okay, then I got all of their performance ratings from the Illinois report card. This is directly from the Illinois State Board of Education here. The Illinois report card. This is from the whole district. They have things like chronic absenteeism, teacher retention, student mobility, things like that. I found all of their scores here. Then I put all of that information into SPSS to calculate the statistics. There are in total 86 cases, 15 of which did not receive trees. The other 80 did receive trees. I did not include private schools that received trees but have since closed, or schools that did not receive a state rating for whatever reason. Okay. These are my variables. You can pause this to look this over a little more if you like. Note that each of the variable with a 19 at the end has represents a score for the year of 2019, and it has a corresponding variable of 15 for the year of 2015. So of my 3 neighborhood variables, I have target received, target non-received, and other received. The target variables are the schools within the target neighborhoods that I highlighted earlier. Received means they did receive trees from Openlands. Non-received did not receive trees from Openlands. And other received are all of the other schools within Chicago that received trees that were not in the target neighborhood. So for my methodology, I did a paired samples t-test for the quantitative data first. The quantitative data was their performance results. And just to show you one more time, that would be their state score, city score, teacher retention, 3-year average percentage of teachers returning to work, percentage of students who miss 10% or more of school days without valid excuse, percentage of average daily attendance, and the total number of students enrolled at the school over a given year. That was my quantitative data. Then I did another paired samples t-test over the qualitative data. That was their survey results compared over the 5-year period. Those were effective leadership, collaborative teachers, supportive environment, ambitious instruction, and involved families. Then I did a Spearman correlation to compare only the target neighborhood schools, comparing the ones that did receive to the ones that did not receive, to see if there was any location results that I could find there, something that would suggest that there was no difference in whether or not it was green, but it was perhaps their neighborhood instead. Then I considered future research. So the results that I found altogether, the variables that I did find significant, I only found three. Of all of these variables that I tested, only three of them actually proved significant over the 5-year period. That was chronic truancy and enrollment. Those are the only two quantitative data that I found. The one qualitative was collaborative teachers, and it actually was negative. Uh, so I do want to note that I hypothesized that teacher retention would go up considerably, but it actually did not prove significant for any change whatsoever. But I did find that chronic truancy in recipient schools went up and enrollment still declined. And I found that interesting since that was also not what I expected. I compared it to city scores. I wanted to know, are these good, comparatively good or comparatively bad? And indeed, compared to the city's chronic truancy has gone up 6% in the same time period, and the city's enrollment has gone down 8.52% in the same time period. So while these are still ugly scores, they're comparatively bringing down the city's average from the non-recipients. So you can see the non-recipient result wasn't significant. That's an asterisk showing it was not significant. But the enrollment decline was significant at negative 10.38%. Quite a significant decline in enrollment, much higher than the city average. So what I gathered from the results were that while these results still were not what I was hoping to see, it is showing me that they are suffering less from the city trends than the non-recipients. So I do think that it is helping in that way. It's giving it a little buffer from the negative trends that have been happening. There we go. So only the recipient schools got a significant score for collaborative teachers in the qualitative data survey, and it went down negative 0.271 points on a scale of 1 to 5. So it didn't go down that much, but I did find it very interesting that it did, if anything, go down. I would have only expected it to go up, if anything at all. And the non-recipient schools, again, did not have any significant result there. And I also do want to note that the city did not have results for the survey from the city as a whole. They only did it by school basis, not for the whole city. So that's why there is a not any here. For the rest of my results that were non-significant, I want to note that daily attendance, that while it was not significant, I did find it as a potential discrepancy. Because while chronic truancy would be as high as 50% in some schools, it would be as low as 1% in other schools, but both of those schools would have the same daily attendance rate. I found that to be very strange. So I don't know if there is maybe something going on with schools reporting their daily attendance, but something about that didn't seem right. Every school had a 94, 95, 96 daily attendance rate, no matter what their chronic absenteeism or chronic truancy was. I found that very interesting. 3-year retention rate. There was an improvement of almost 10% in the non-recipient schools, but it was still non-significant, which I would expect it to not be significant because there is no reason why retention should go up in the non-recipient schools, but not the recipient schools. 3-year retention rate wasn't significant. The reason that I think this is because the 5-year retention rate is the rate that's so incredible, but they don't measure 5-year retention rate. They only measure 3-year retention rate. So I would like to do this test again with 5-year retention rate data. I just don't have. From the t-test, the two that were significant was chronic truancy and total enrollment. for this much. I calculated this number of total enrollment as a percentage. That is where I got the negative 0.75%. And I did the same thing for the target non-received. Again, that was the only one considered significant for them. I got this amount, which I calculated as a percentage. That's where I got this. For the city of Chicago, this is how I calculated the percent of decrease for them over the 5 years. And that was from Illinois Report Card. Paired samples to test for qualitative data of the recipient schools here. This was the only one that showed significance. Can't believe it. None were significant for the non-recipient schools. None of them. But that was expected. And these are all my SPS outputs. This is what I compared to for the city. And that's everything. So lastly, on the Spearman's correlation test that I ran on the target recipient schools and the target non-recipient schools, I got some interesting results that were kind of expected, but I was expecting a little more. What I was expecting to get out of this was a decrease in correlation over time, because I would assume that of the schools that did receive trees, they would experience growth, perhaps, while the non-recipient schools did not receive growth. And while I didn't find growth from the other tests that I ran, the Spearman's correlation did show me that they were less correlated over time. So here in my correlation, the 5 results from 2015, here and here, they were all correlated in 2015, every single one of them. But in 2019, here, only 2 of them were correlated. Random result that I was not expecting to get was a supportive environment was negatively correlated to city score only in 2015. I don't know what the implications are of that, but that is the results that I got. So, of the implications that I could find, for students, as it applies to truancy and enrollment, while the numbers were unfortunate, the comparative results showed improvement. Could this be indicative that greening schools encourage students to be around an enjoyable green atmosphere? And for teachers, as it pertains to retention, unexpectedly there was no significance in 3-year retention despite the literature. Could we consider a 5-year retention score that we can then measure and calculate? For the environment as in school environment, survey respondents showed us that the student and teacher respondents to the survey reported no significant change over the given timeline for the factors considered essential for school growth. Potentially, could there be more time needed for greening to have an effect that we would expect to see on the school environment? I do want to note again that the survey of the 5 essentials was given to all of the schools, but the respondents were students and teachers, not parents. So these students and teachers self-reported their feelings on the school. Could that create a discrepancy? I'm not sure, but I do know that the respondent percentage was as high as 80 to 90% of the school body every time. So since the survey didn't show any significant change over time, that leads me to believe that the greening of schools either takes more time to alter the environment or it just doesn't. So I have 3 pages of resources here. You can pause at any time to go back and look at the ones I noted in my literature review or look them up on your own. But otherwise, that is the end of my research. Those are all the conclusions that I came to. That's everything that I found.